What if the bride you prayed for, a plain woman of quiet strength, is not the one who stepped off the train? What if instead she was breathtakingly beautiful, carrying secrets that could shatter your life and ignite a storm of envy, danger, and desire? Would you turn away to protect your heart or risk everything to uncover the truth of who she really is? The Wyoming sun blazed like a pitiless overseer, stripping the prairie of color until all that remained was dust, heat, and the desperate cry of cicadas. Jacob Thornton stood rigid on the warped porch of his homestead, one hand shading his eyes as he scanned the brittle pasture where his cattle staggered like shadows. The land had hardened against him, refusing to yield water or grain, its silence as cruel as any curse. In his hand trembled a letter, creased, sweat-stained, and already read to the point of memorization. It was not a love letter, it was a confession of surrender. Weeks earlier, with no one left to share his burdens and no neighbors willing to lend more than pity, Jacob had written to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis. He had asked not for beauty, nor for youth, nor for the softness of romance. He had asked only for a plain woman, steady and unremarkable, someone who could keep the fire alive when winter winds howled, someone who would not awaken feelings he had long ago buried beside his wife Martha. The agency had answered. Today, at noon, a train would screech into Willow Creek carrying the woman who might decide the fate of his ranch. The townsfolk already whispered about the hermit rancher buying himself a bride. Jacob could feel their judgment like a noose around his neck. Yet even as shame gnawed at him, another fear burned deeper. What if she didn't come at all? With a clean white shirt clinging to his back, one he hadn't worn since Martha's funeral, Jacob hitched his team to the wagon. Each turn of the wheels ground like a drumbeat of fate, carrying him toward the station, toward the eyes of the town, toward a stranger who would soon share his name. The town of Willow Creek lay sprawled along a single street, its buildings weathered gray like bones left to the Sunday. By the time Jacob's wagon rattled into view, word of his errand had already spread. Curtains twitched. Men spat tobacco juice and leaned on their posts. Women pressed gloved fingers to their lips and whispered with pity or amusement. The hermit was fetching himself a mail-order bride. Jacob's jaw set hard as he tied his horses near the platform. He felt their stares burn into his back, felt their judgment coil around his chest like a tightening rope. Even Reverend Collins had come, Bible clutched so tightly it might split. Beside the station wall, the Garrison brothers lounged with their flask, sneering as though Jacob's shame was free entertainment. The shriek of the incoming train cut the air, long and mournful. Black smoke unfurled across the horizon, and a hush swept through the gathering crowd. Jacob's heart stumbled in his chest. He had asked for plain, for simple, for steady. He had prayed for nothing that might stir his heart again. The locomotive roared into the station, iron wheels screeching as sparks flew. Doors swung open, spilling travelers, salesmen with battered cases, mothers herding restless children, miners with soot ground into their skin. Jacob's eyes darted from face to face, searching for the woman he had imagined. A matron in plain dress, gray perhaps, with hands hardened by work. Then the world stilled. From the carriage doorway stepped a figure that silenced the station. A woman, poised and composed, with hair the color of ripe wheat tucked beneath a modest hat. Her dress was simple, but no cloth could conceal the grace in her posture or the radiance of her face. Honey-colored eyes swept the crowd before settling on Jacob. Emma Foster. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Good Lord above, someone muttered. That can't be her. Yet it was. She descended with quiet dignity, carrying a single trunk. Jacob's breath caught. This was no plain bride. This was beauty incarnate, the very curse he had sought to escape. When she reached him, her voice rang steady as mountain water. Mr. Thornton, I presume. I am Emma Foster. Jacob's throat tightened. He managed only a stiff nod as he reached for her trunk. Their hands brushed one fleeting touch, and it struck him like lightning. The crowd hissed. She must be running from something. Mrs., Henderson whispered. One of the Garrison brothers grinned. She won't last a month. Emma ignored them all. Her chin lifted with subtle defiance, her gaze unwavering. Side by side, they walked to the wagon, the gossip trailing after them like storm clouds. The wagon rolled out of town beneath the crushing noon sun, hooves striking sparks from the parched earth. Behind them, voices still buzzed, threads of gossip weaving a net Jacob knew would follow them for months. Ahead stretched the barren prairie, dust curling into the air with every turn of the wheels. For a long while, silence reigned. Emma sat with her back straight, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the far horizon. Jacob stole glances from the corner of his eye. He had wished for quietness, yet the hush unsettled him, for it left too much room for thought, and all his thoughts circled her beauty. At last he spoke, his voice rough. "It isn't what you expected, is it, this land?" Her honey-colored eyes flicked toward him, then back to the horizon. "I expected nothing," she answered softly. "Expectations are luxuries I can no longer afford." The words settled heavy between them, carrying secrets she did not share. Jacob noticed the whiteness of her knuckles, the tight set of her jaw. This was no naive girl seeking adventure. She carried shadows, just as he did. When they crested a rise, Jacob pointed ahead. There at Island, the homestead appeared small against the endless prairie. The house leaned into the wind, boards gray and warped. The barn roof sagged where storms had torn it. The chicken coop crouched near a garden gone to dust. "It's very peaceful," Emma said quietly. Jacob's jaw tightened. "It's lonely." Her eyes lingered on him, unreadable. "Sometimes lonely is what a person needs." The words pierced deeper than she knew. He urged the horses forward, unwilling to reply. At the ranch, Jacob carried her trunk inside, showing her the side room that had once been Martha's sewing space. "It isn't much," he muttered. "It will do," Emma replied, placing her hand on the narrow bed. Then, briskly, "Where's the water?" He showed her the pump that groaned with every pull. She studied it, then turned to the chicken coop, asking about eggs. At the garden, she sifted the soil through her fingers. "The ground isn't dead," she said, "just thirsty." Jacob stared. He had seen only failure. She saw possibility. That frightened him more than he could say. By evening, Emma moved with quiet efficiency through the kitchen. The smell of biscuits and bean soup filled the air, wrapping the house in a warmth it had not known in years. Jacob sat at the table pretending to mend tack, but his eyes strayed again and again at supper. Silence stretched until Jacob cleared his throat. "We should be clear about arrangements. You'll have your room, I'll have mine. We share the work, nothing more." Emma set down her spoon. "That suits me. I did not come seeking tenderness. Relief should have come. Instead, disappointment knotted his chest. Days bled into weeks. The rhythm of survival bound them together. At dawn, Emma stoked the fire, her hair loose and golden in the glow of embers. She scrubbed floors, kneaded bread from meager flour, hauled buckets until her arms trembled. Jacob rode the range, patched fences, and fought the land's endless hunger. They spoke little, but in the silence grew an awareness, an undercurrent neither dared name. The drought deepened. The well sputtered, coughing mud. Coyotes yipped closer at night. One evening, Jacob found prints by the pasture, larger than any coyote. Wolves. Over supper, he told Emma they would need to keep watch. "I can shoot," she said calmly. Jacob frowned. "You?" Her gaze was steady. "My father believed a woman alone should know how. I brought my rifle." True to her word, she took the porch that night, rifle laid across her knees, posture still as stone. Jacob woke before dawn and found her there, eyes sharp, hair damp with dew. When the wolves came, it was Emma's bullet that struck first, clean and true. Jacob joined her, and side by side they drove the pack into the shadows. At sunrise, as they stood over the fallen beast, Jacob asked, "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Emma's gaze lingered on the horizon. When you have something worth protecting, you learn. Something shifted inside him. For the first time, he saw not just her beauty, but her strength, her fire. And that awakened a more dangerous longing. Weeks later, with the well nearly dry, Emma insisted on digging near a cluster of cottonwoods. Jacob scoffed. He had searched his land for years. But desperation bent his pride. Together they dug, blisters splitting their hands, sweat streaking their clothes. At last the shovel struck damp soil. By nightfall, water seeped from the pit. Jacob sat on the edge, staring at her in wonder. "How did you know?" "My grandfather taught me," she said softly. "Sometimes you must listen to the land." Starlight flickered in her eyes. For a breath, Jacob leaned closer, the world narrowing to that single spark between them until a coyote's cry split the night, breaking the spell. They walked home in silence, but something unspoken pulsed between them, fierce and undeniable. The arrangement they had declared business only was crumbling. Then came the storm. Rain lashed the parched earth, drumming the roof with thunderous joy. Emma laughed, spinning in the downpour, her dress clinging to her frame, her hair a stream of gold. Jacob called her inside, but she only twirled, radiant and alive. When lightning tore the sky, they stumbled indoors, dripping and breathless. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She looked up, eyes shining, lips parted as though on the edge of confession. The storm outside raged. The storm inside had only begun. The rain eased by morning, leaving the prairie glistening and raw. Jacob awoke to an uneasy stillness, the kind that felt like the world was holding its breath. As he mended the chicken coop, the thud of hooves broke the silence, sharp, deliberate, unlike the weary gait of ranch horses. A lone rider approached, cutting a dark figure against the washed sky. His stallion was sleek, his coat pressed fine, his boots polished as if the mud itself bent out of his way. He carried himself with the arrogance of wealth, his eyes cold as steel when they settled on Jacob. "You must be Thornton," the man said, his voice smooth but edged with menace. "I am Charles Whitman, and I believe you have something of mine." Before Jacob could answer, the door creaked open. Emma stepped outside, a bucket in her hands. When her gaze landed on the rider, her face drained of color. The bucket fell, water spilling into the dust. "Hello, Emma," Whitman drawled, striking a match to light his cigar. "You've led me quite a chase." Her voice trembled yet held steady. "You have no right." "Oh, but I do." Whitman unfurled a folded paper, crisp despite the rain. "Your father's debts. $20,000 cleared in exchange for you. His signature, that makes you mine." Jacob stepped forward, jaw tight. "She's my wife. Whatever claim you thought you had ends here." Whitman's smile sharpened. "Wife? I checked. No papers, no church vows, just two sinners playing house. That makes her free for the taking." His gaze slid over Emma like a brand. "And I'll be taking her back." Jacob's fist flew before thought could catch it. The blow sent Whitman staggering, blood blooming at his lip. He straightened, eyes blazing with cold fury. "That was a mistake, Thornton. I'll return with the law." He mounted his black horse, spurring it hard, and thundered off into the horizon, leaving the promise of ruin in his wake. Emma crumpled to her knees, shaking. "You don't know him," she whispered. "He'll destroy everything to get me back." Jacob knelt beside her, fierce resolve burning in his chest. "Let him try. I won't lose you." The next day, the promise of ruin arrived. Whitman returned, but not alone. He rode at the head of a small procession. Sheriff Morrison, the county judge, and a throng of townsfolk, curious to witness the spectacle. Dust rose behind their horses as they crowded into Jacob's yard, faces eager for drama. Whitman dismounted with calculated calm, brandishing the contract like a weapon. "Sheriff, judge, here is the proof. Emma Foster is mine by law and debt." His voice rang with the arrogance of a man convinced the world bent to his wealth. Emma stood on the porch, her hands clenched, her eyes defiant though pale. "I am not a possession." The judge adjusted his spectacles, frowning at the paper. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. $20,000 more money than most would see in a lifetime. Jacob stepped forward, his voice steady though his blood boiled. "How much?" "25,000 with interest," Whitman sneered. Gasps burst from the crowd. The figure was impossible. No rancher could meet it. Whitman's smirk widened, savoring Jacob's cornered silence. But Jacob's hand dropped to his gun belt. Then we settle it another way. You and me. Winner takes all. The street hushed. Even the prairie wind seemed to pause. Sheriff Morrison narrowed his eyes. Thornton, you sure about this? Jacob nodded once. Whitman's grin stretched wolf-like. I've killed 7 men in fair fights. You'll make number 8. The duel was set for noon the following day on Willow Creek's Main Street. Word spread faster than wildfire. Farmers left fields, merchants shuttered shops, families crowded wagons, all drawn to the promise of blood. Emma moved through that day like a ghost, torn between terror and resolve. She had run to escape being claimed as property, only to find herself once more at the center of men's wagers. Yet when she looked at Jacob standing tall in his quiet determination, something inside her steadied. He was not fighting to own her, he was fighting to let her choose her own life. That night, as the prairie sky burned with stars, Jacob sat at the kitchen table polishing his revolver with slow, deliberate strokes. Emma lingered in the doorway, watching him. If you die tomorrow, she whispered, I'll be dragged back into chains. Jacob looked up, his eyes steady. Then I cannot afford to die. High noon. The sun blazed unblinking above Willow Creek, the air thick with dust and dread. The street had become an arena, lined with townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder. Murmurs rippled like wind through wheat, then died as Sheriff Morrison raised a white handkerchief. At one end stood Jacob, his shirt plain, his revolver resting steady at his side. At the other, Whitman gleamed in polished boots and a tailored coat, arrogance radiating like heat. He smirked, confident in his speed, his record, his reputation. Emma stood among the crowd, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched, her eyes never left Jacob. When the handkerchief falls, the sheriff called, "Draw." Time slowed. The cloth drifted, twisting in the breeze. Whitman's hand snapped like a striking snake, his pistol cracking thunder across the street. Dust exploded near Jacob's boots too fast, too wild. Jacob did not rush. He stepped sideways, calm as stone, his draw deliberate, his aim unerring. His bullet struck Whitman's shoulder, spinning him into the dirt. The crowd erupted, shouts, gasps, the roar of disbelief. Whitman groaned, clutching his wound, his polished coat darkening with blood. He glared up, snarling, "Finish it, Thornton! Kill me!" Jacob advanced, gun leveled. The crowd hushed, holding its breath. For a moment he stood poised to end the man, to silence the threat forever. But then Jacob holstered the weapon, his voice iron. "You'll live, but you'll leave. Come near her again, and I won't miss." From his vest he drew a folded paper, crisp and newly signed. He held it high so all could see. A marriage certificate. Reverend Collins witnessed it this very morning. "Emma is my wife, legal and binding. You've lost." A murmur swelled into cheers. The judge nodded. The sheriff lowered his hand. Whitman staggered to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he spat. But the crowd saw him now for what he was, a beaten man. With his pride bleeding into the dust, Whitman mounted his horse and rode from Willow Creek, his shadow shrinking with every stride. Emma's breath shuddered free. Jacob turned toward her, and in her eyes he saw not relief alone, but the spark of something deeper, trust, fragile yet unbreakable. That night, the prairie lay hushed beneath a pale moon, as if the land itself exhaled after holding its breath. Inside the small ranch house, the windows rattled with the restless wind. Jacob sat by the fire, Emma beside him, both still carrying the echo of gunfire in their chests. "I spent 3 years believing I had nothing left to lose," Jacob murmured, staring into the flames. "But when you walked off that train, I realized how much I had left to fear loneliness, walls, the emptiness of never feeling again. And losing those fears was worth everything." Emma turned her face toward him, her golden hair lit like a halo in the firelight. "I thought I came west, running from a prison," she whispered. "Instead, I found home." The words cracked something open in Jacob. He reached for her hand, and for the first time neither of them pulled away. Her fingers wove into his, firm and certain. The silence that followed was not heavy but tender, a silence that belonged not to strangers but to two souls learning the shape of each other's hearts. Days passed and the ranch shifted like a wound healing. Where once the house stood stripped and barren, Emma's touch brought warmth. She hung curtains on the windows, planted seeds in the thirsty soil, and filled the rooms with the smell of baking bread. Neighbors who once mocked now stopped by with quiet respect, offering tools, seed, even laughter. Jacob, who had lived as a hermit, found himself drawn back into the fabric of the community. Men nodded at him on the street. Women spoke to Emma with cautious admiration, and children lingered near the fence, curious about the golden-haired lady who had tamed the hermit's silence. Yet none of that mattered as much as the quiet moments between them. Emma's laugh as she gathered eggs at dawn, Jacob's steady hand as he guided her on horseback across the fields, the way their eyes found each other across a table, wordless but full. What began as a contract of necessity had become something neither dared dream of: companionship, resilience, and the tender roots of love. Seasons shifted across the Wyoming prairie, each one carving its mark into the ranch. Spring coaxed stubborn shoots from the earth, summer blazed mercilessly, autumn scattered gold across the grass, and winter laid its hush of snow. Through each turn of the wheel, Jacob and Emma worked side by side. Where once silence had pressed between them, now words flowed in quiet abundance. She told him stories of her childhood, of evenings by the hearth, listening to her grandfather speak of the land's secret language. He told her of Martha, his first wife, not with bitterness but with reverence, the memory softened by time. Emma listened without jealousy, honoring the woman who had shaped the man she now loved. One morning, as frost clung silver to the fence rails, Jacob returned from the pasture to find Emma bent over the garden. She had coaxed life where once only dust lay. Rows of green rose stubborn against the prairie wind, promising tomatoes, beans, and squash. She looked up at him with soil on her hands and determination in her eyes. See, the land was only waiting for someone to believe in it. Jacob felt something swell in his chest, pride, gratitude, love so sharp it ached. He had prayed for plainness, for stillness, yet had been given a woman who breathed life into everything she touched. Neighbors began to linger longer when they visited. They came not only out of respect, but because laughter had returned to the Thornton Ranch. Children chased chickens across the yard. Women brought cloth scraps to trade. Men shared news of cattle prices and fences. The hermit's house had become a hearth for the community. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in violet and gold, Jacob and Emma sat on the porch. He watched her eyes follow the stars kindling above. "I once thought beauty was a curse," Jacob admitted. "But I was wrong. Your beauty isn't what endangers me, it's what saves me. It reminds me there's still light worth guarding." Emma turned, her hand finding his. "And I once thought marriage meant chains. But here, with you, it means freedom." The prairie stretched endless before them, no longer barren but alive with promise. Together they had transformed not only a ranch but each other. Winter descended heavy, snow drifting high against the fence lines, muffling the world into stillness. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped bright, throwing gold across the walls. Jacob sat near the hearth, mending tack, while Emma hummed softly as she stirred a pot on the stove. The melody, simple and sweet, filled the house with a peace he had not known in years. When she carried bowls to the table, Jacob caught her hand and held it. She looked down, surprise flickering into warmth. "Emma," he said, his voice low but steady, "I have kept many words locked inside me, fearing their weight, but tonight I can't keep them longer. I love you." Her breath caught, and for a moment silence wrapped them both. Then she set the bowls aside and leaned close, pressing her forehead to his. "And I love you, Jacob," she whispered. "You are not the man I expected, you are the man I choose." Snow thickened against the windows, but inside the warmth deepened. Their marriage, once an arrangement of survival, had become a covenant of choice, shaped not by need but by devotion. With Emma's touch, the house softened, Curtains swayed in the window, a garden promised harvest beneath the snow, and laughter had become a familiar sound. Neighbors no longer saw Jacob as the hermit, but as a man reborn. He was no longer defined by drought, by grief, or by loneliness. He was defined by love. And through every hardship that followed the lean seasons, the long rides across frozen prairie, the endless labor there remained one unshakable truth. They had chosen each other, and that choice made them strong. The man who had once prayed for a plain bride had found instead the woman who transformed his world. Not what he wanted, but precisely what he needed. The tale of Jacob Thornton and Emma Foster is not merely the story of a rancher and his unexpected bride. It is the story of how two wounded souls, each carrying shadows of loss and fear, discovered that love cannot be bargained for, nor chosen by the safe desires of the mind. It arrives unbidden, often disguised as risk, sometimes even as peril, and yet it carries within it the power to restore what seemed forever broken. Jacob believed he needed plainness, silence, and the safety of a heart that would never stir again. He prayed for a partner who would never awaken the ache of longing. What he received instead was a woman whose beauty stirred every whisper of danger, whose presence threatened to unravel the walls he had built. And yet it was in breaking those walls that Jacob rediscovered life. Emma's laughter turned dust into seed, her courage made wolves retreat, her tenderness transformed a barren house into a home. Emma believed she was running from a father's debts, from a man who would chain her as payment, from the weight of being seen as nothing more than a possession. What she found was not merely shelter, but dignity. With Jacob, she discovered that true strength does not come from escaping alone, but from standing beside someone who chooses you freely, not as property, but as partner. The prairie tested them both. Drought, wolves, storm, and duel all threatened to break what they had barely begun to build. Yet each trial became the forge where trust was tempered. Each hardship drew them closer, until their bond was no longer born of desperation, but of deliberate choice. The lesson is this: love is seldom what we expect and almost never what we believe we deserve. It arrives as a challenge, demanding courage, asking us to risk the very pain we fear most. But when met with faith, with compassion, and with resolve, love reveals itself not as a burden, but as a salvation. So let us remember Jacob and Emma not for the gossip that followed them, nor the duel that nearly shattered them, but for the quiet truth they lived, that sometimes what we ask for is not what we need, that sometimes the very thing we dread is the thing that heals us. And that beauty, when joined with strength, can turn loneliness into belonging, silence into laughter, and survival into joy. In the end, the Wyoming prairie did not change. The wind still howled, the winter still bit, the earth still demanded toil, but Jacob and Emma changed. They found in each other the one gift the land itself could not give: love freely chosen, love fiercely guarded, love that made the barren prairie bloom. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that no matter how dry the soil of our lives may seem, there is always water hidden deep below, waiting for the patient hand, the stubborn heart, and the brave soul who dares to believe it can be found.